Thanks for joining our Keto on the Go program this week. I'm Leighton Phillips, the founder of SFuels. Wanted to share an answer to a question we get quite a lot of, which is certain foods that can accelerate or heighten ketogenesis. And sometimes there's almost a feeling of guilt of using certain foods to produce ketones. And I just wanted to be clear on a few foods that will really support, if you will, the upgrade, the upregulation of some of those metabolic pathways that increase ketones in the body. So let's take a look at that. I'll share some of this material now. Hopefully you can see this on the screen. Okay, so firstly, one thing I would say is that when we talk about these foods, they don't have to be some dramatic, complex food, etc., to put together to get the ketogenic effect. I'm going to leave you with 3 drinks that are really simple to help accelerate the genesis of ketones. And maybe before we will get into the research on, why we would do this, some of the known research and the meta studies that are showing what the effect of heightened ketones is in the serum, in the blood serum. Let's start firstly though with ketones and ketogenesis itself. When we're talking about this, it is just that metabolic pathway that produces these ketone bodies, and that can provide an alternate form of energy in the body. Multiple tissues can use, of course, ketones, and those ketones can produce 22 ATP each in normal circumstances. And this ketogenesis has a lot to do with the regulation of insulin. As insulin goes up, of course, our genesis or the creation of ketones will go down. So we're trying to avoid that. So when we think about this pathway and foods to accelerate, why would we do it? And I wanted to, and I'll make sure we put the links to each of these studies in the show notes. But for, if you will, collective studies, some of these are systematic reviews and meta-analyses. Some of them are, double-blind intervention studies. Some of them are actually purely in vitro, meaning that they're just done in a dish, a petri dish, outside of the body, which does have its implications. And then obviously we've got examples of using this in vivo or in humans. So on the left-hand side, exogenous ketones. Sometimes, of course, it's perceived that this is almost cheating, if you will. But one of the interesting meta studies that was done is to look across a number of studies to understand collectively when ketones are taken exogenously into the body, what happens to blood sugars, blood glucose, I should say. And there is a reduction in the amounts of or measured blood glucose as a function of taking exogenous ketones. And this is obviously interesting to us in the spirit of, as we manage a more lowered and stable level of blood glucose, our insulin levels obviously are not going to be required to be triggered to stimulate the pancreas to actually release more insulin into the body, and by that improve and increase ketogenesis itself. So that's the first study, and again, we'll make sure we put the links to this in the show notes. The second one is a very interesting one, and this is really calling out. They were testing, if you will, just coconut oil, and then they were testing, if you will, extracts in forms of medium chain triglycerides. When we say MCT, we're talking about the length of the carbon chains that are inside of those fatty acids, if you will. There's the longer chains, think of your classic oils, etc. The medium chain triglycerides can come from things like cream from dairy, it can come from coconut oil, etc. And what you'll find is that there's certain types of those medium chain triglycerides, particularly one known as C8, which is referring to the numbers of those carbon molecules inside of the MCT. And the C8 particularly is the most ketogenic. What this study was showing is that when you actually have that also with caffeine, there's even a further heightened level of ketogenesis in the body. So MCT C8 plus caffeine. The third study was really around the effects of, and they looked at both prolonged intermittent fasting. They looked at calorie restriction on, on neuronal health. And they looked at when you introduced, and again, this was done in vitro, meaning, if you will, in a lab, where they looked at neuronal cells, and they introduced glucose, they introduced ketones, exogenous ketones with glucose, and they saw what those neurons did in terms of use for energy to sustain themselves. And clearly, neuronal cells, the brain, et cetera, can use glucose, can also use ketones. But what this study showed is that even when there was an amount of glucose there, those neuronal tissues were also using ketones. And it was reducing the anaerobic form of metabolism, and it was starting to use some of these ketones in more an aerobic metabolism, etc. And this was very interesting in the spirit of neuronal health. This particular study begins to call out, some of the conditions associated with neuronal health or decline of neuronal health, where there is just an overabundance of glucose pouring through the blood serum from our diet and lifestyle. By introducing the exogenous ketones and not being so reliant on glucose, this study just calls out and talks to the value of this potentially to neuronal health, which is certainly interesting today. If you look at the latter years of people, of course, one of the areas that affects so many people, the dementias and Parkinson's and things like this, where the neuronal health is certainly not like it was when we are younger. The right-hand side is the final study, which is the use of exogenous ketones, and it's looking at how it can offset the effects of muscle breakdown that happens. Particularly, you'll see this in eccentric exercise, running, etc., jogging, etc. Any of those exercises where the muscle lengthens as part of the contraction of, of the particular sport that's being conducted. And what this study is showing is that by using exogenous ketones, they found that one of the markers that was a marker of muscle breakdown, which is leucine, it was reducing the amount of that leucine being shown up in the blood. There was an increase of muscle protein synthesis as a function of the exogenous ketones being oxidized and used for energy, rather than the body beginning to break down some of that muscle tissue, etc., in exercise. And this is important, of course, for active lifestylers, where we're at the gym in a spin class, box fit, CrossFit, or what have you. How do you offset, if you will, some of that effect that we find where the muscle does get broken down? You can have some delayed onset muscle soreness, etc. Exogenous ketones are showing that they can offset that and actually improve the muscle and protein synthesis. So what I said was 3 simple ways you can do this. It doesn't have to be that complex. We produce a MCT, which is a C8 and a C10 mix from coconut oil in a drink. It comes in 4 flavors. And then we have a separate sachet, which is a product called Primed. And the MCT product, which is called Train, is really these 4 flavors. I think this one here is the pomegranate acai. It can be a strawberry lemonade, coconut lime, etc. And you can mix this with the watermelon primed, which is the caffeine component. One of the things that you'll find with caffeine, and we're going to get to coffee and chocolate shakes in a second. There's nothing wrong with that. However, the amount of caffeine, of course, can vary dramatically depending upon the beans used, how it's obviously had, whether it's blended, etc., or it's the different types of coffees we can have, a drip coffee, etc. In the left-hand side, where we use this primed, It's a extract from green tea extract, and it's a measured dose of 80 milligrams of caffeine in each one of those sachets. So you mix these together into a cold drink. This particular, what we're showing here is the pomegranate and the watermelon mixed together to improve and heighten that ketogenesis. On the right-hand side is two examples of, fairly common drinks of the morning, a coffee, and we can add some of our Revival to that. Now, the Revival has a really quite high dose, 6 grams, in fact, of sodium BHB or ketones. And when you add that to the coffee, etc., you're basically getting your exogenous ketones. The Revival also has the same C8, C10, MCT, medium chain triglycerides in it, and it has the caffeine, of course, from the coffee. Those 3 things together is really covering several of those areas we talked about in those studies. And then, very simply, our Revival chocolate shake is taking the Revival product and mixing that, whether it's with a heavy whipped cream, etc., some ice and some cold water, and putting that into a blender into a shake. Again, that would have your exogenous ketones, MCT, and certainly a degree of caffeine in the cacao that we're using in the Revival product. So these very simple 3 drinks are going to upregulate your ketogenesis. You'll be able to measure that on your ketone meter. You'll see that happen within 60 to 120 minutes. And depending upon, a lot of reasons, of course, how we metabolize it, obviously the dose of the caffeine or the dose you take of any of the SFuels product. All of those recipes you'll find in our Life Guide. And the Life Guide has, I think, about 50 pages there. The QR codes here, again, we'll put the link down into the show notes below here on YouTube, and you can download your Life Guide, and you'll see all of those products, all of those recipes that we just talked about on those 3 drinks. If you want to buy any of the products for the first time at SFuels, use the KetoCon25. This QR code will take you straight into the active lifestyle part of the SFuels site. And you can take a look at that SFuels Train, SFuels Primed, and the Revival product. And you use that KetoCon25 for 25% off, and it'll get you started on upregulating your ketogenesis. I hope that was helpful. It's a question we do get a lot of on how do I increase it? How do I do it simply? And this is 3 simple ideas based on some good science. So thanks for joining our Keto on the Go program. And we'll make sure that we continue to put all of those links in the show notes, and you can check out those products and those research papers. Thanks for joining again for Keto on the Go. We'll look forward to catching up real soon. Thanks again.